You want to know the truth about that morning? I'll tell you, but I need you to understand something first. I was 20 years old. It was my ninth day in the King's Guard. 9 days. I still couldn't tie my collar straight without help, and my boots gave me blisters I was too proud to mention. 9 days, and I was already standing on the most famous square in Renfeld, in front of Greymont Palace, with a rifle on my shoulder and my heart going like a drum. People think being a guard is about standing still. It isn't. It's about everything you're not allowed to do while standing still. You're not allowed to scratch your nose. You're not allowed to look at the pretty girl waving at you. You're not allowed to flinch when a child screams in your face just to see if you'll break. And you're absolutely not allowed to leave your post. That last one, remember that one, because that's the whole story really. It was a Tuesday in early spring. I remember because Marsh told me Tuesdays were the worst for crowds, and I didn't believe him until I saw it for myself. The whole square outside Greymont was packed shoulder to shoulder by 9:30. Tourists with their cameras held up high. Schoolchildren in little matching coats, holding a rope so they wouldn't wander off. Old couples on the benches near the fountain, feeding the pigeons even though there's a sign that says, very clearly, "Please do not feed the pigeons." The air smelled like rain that hadn't come yet. You know that smell? Heavy and green, like the sky's making up its mind. The flags on the palace roof kept snapping in the wind, then going still, then snapping again. And there I was, stiff as a fence post, sweating under a coat that weighed more than a small dog. Next to me, 4 feet to my left, stood Edwin Marsh. Let me tell you about Marsh, because you can't understand what happened without understanding him. Marsh had been in the Guard for 19 years. 19. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same gray stone as the palace itself, broad through the shoulders, a jaw you could have cracked walnuts on. He never raised his voice. He never had to. When Marsh told you to do something, you did it and you thanked him after. The younger lads were terrified of him. I was too that first week. He caught me slouching on day 3 and didn't say a word. He just looked at me. That was all. One look and I straightened up so fast I nearly pulled something in my back. But here's the thing about Marsh that took me longer to learn. Underneath all that stone, he was the gentlest man I ever served beside. He had a daughter. Her name was Tilly. She was 7. He kept a little photograph of her tucked inside his coat against his chest, even though we weren't supposed to carry personal things on duty. Everyone knew about it. Nobody ever reported it. Some rules you just leave alone. He used to talk about Tilly during the quiet hours, when the changing of the guard was done and the crowds thinned, and it was just the two of us and the sound of the wind. He'd talk low, barely moving his lips, so the tourists couldn't tell. "She lost her front tooth last week," he told me once. "Cried for an hour. Then I told her the tooth fairy pays double for the front ones, and suddenly it was the best day of her life." I laughed quietly. You learn to laugh without moving your face. It's a skill. "You got kids, Pell?" he asked me. "No, sir, I'm 20. "That's what your mouth says." He almost smiled, almost. "Give it time." That was Marsh, stone on the outside, a father all the way through. Now the royal family. Greymont wasn't just a tourist palace. It was a working royal residence. Prince Alaric lived there with his wife, Princess Adela, and their daughter, the little one, Princess Cora. Cora was 6 years old. You have to understand how the whole kingdom felt about that child. Renfeld had gone through some hard years before she was born. There'd been the long illness of the old king. There'd been the floods in the eastern provinces, the ones that took whole villages. There'd been a stretch where it felt like the country had forgotten how to be happy. And then Cora was born, a little princess with a gap-toothed grin and hair that never, ever stayed where her nanny put it. The whole country fell in love with her at once. You'd see her face on the front of every paper. Cora waving from a carriage. Cora hiding behind her mother's coat at a public event. Cora, age 4, escaping her father's grip at a garden party and running full speed toward a flock of geese, shrieking with joy, while half the royal guard quietly panicked behind their stone faces. She was the kingdom's heart. That's not me being poetic, that's just what she was. And Prince Alaric, her father, he was not a man who handled threats to that heart well. I'd heard the stories before I ever joined the guard. Everyone had. How he'd once stopped his own motorcade in the middle of the city because he'd seen a child crying alone on a corner, and he'd gotten out in front of everyone, security losing their minds, just to make sure the kid was all right. How he didn't care about protocol when it came to his daughter. How the cold royal mask the public saw would crack the instant Cora was in the room. People loved him for it, but the older guards used to mutter that it made him hard to protect. A man who will throw himself toward danger instead of away from it. That's a nightmare for the men whose job is keeping him safe. I didn't understand that yet. Day 9, remember, I understood almost nothing. The morning carried on the way mornings do. Slow. The light got brighter, then duller as the clouds shifted. A tour group from somewhere far away stood in front of us for nearly 20 minutes taking the same photograph over and over. A little boy stuck his tongue out at me. I did not stick mine back, though I wanted to. Around 11, word came down the line. You feel these things before you hear them in the guard. A kind of tightening. The officers near the gate started standing differently. Radios crackled. The crowd, sensing something, pressed a little closer to the railings. The royal family was coming out. It wasn't a big planned event. That's what I learned later. It was supposed to be small. Princess Adela was opening a children's garden a short walk from the palace, a little patch of green the city had planted for the kids of families who'd lost homes in the eastern floods. A kind, quiet thing. The sort of event Adela loved and Alaric usually let her do alone. But Cora had begged to come. She'd heard there'd be other children there. And nobody, not her mother, not her father, not the entire security apparatus of the kingdom of Renfeld, could say no to that gap-toothed grin. So out they came. I want to tell you what it's like to see them in person, the first time, when you're 9 days in and your whole body is screaming at you to stay still. It's like the air changes weight. The crowd made a sound, not a cheer exactly, more like a long exhale, hundreds of people breathing out at once. Princess Adela came first, in a soft blue coat, smiling, lifting her hand to wave. Behind her, Prince Alaric, tall and serious, scanning the crowd the way a father scans a crowd, not looking for friends, looking for threats. I didn't know that's what he was doing at the time. I just thought he looked stern. And between them, holding her father's hand and skipping, actually skipping, was Princess Cora. She had on a little yellow coat, bright yellow like a flower. Her hair was already escaping its ribbon. She was waving at everyone and no one, both hands, the way small children do, like the whole world was her friend and she couldn't wait to meet it. The crowd melted. You could feel it. All those serious adults turning to soft butter at the sight of one happy little girl. Marsh beside me didn't move a muscle, but I heard him just barely under his breath. There she is, he said, soft, like he was talking about Tilly. The plan was simple. The family would walk along the front of the railings for a short while, a walkabout, they call it, shaking a few hands, accepting a few flowers, letting the crowd feel close to them. Then they'd move toward the garden a few streets over. Guards lined the route. Plainclothes officers moved through the crowd. Everything was watched. And yet, I have thought about this so many times since, how everything was watched and it still almost happened. The family started down the line. Adela took flowers from a little girl and crouched to talk to her, and the crowd cooed. Alaric shook hands, nodded, said the small things royals say. And Cora wanted to do everything her parents did. She reached for flowers. She tried to shake hands with people whose hands were far too big for hers. She laughed at her own jokes. They came closer to where Marsh and I stood, 20 feet, 15. That's when I noticed the man. I almost didn't. That's the part that haunts me. I was 20, I was overwhelmed. I was watching a real-life princess walk toward me, and I almost didn't notice him at all. He was standing near the railing, maybe 4 people back from the front. Middle-aged. A gray jacket zipped all the way up even though it wasn't that cold. A cap pulled low. Nothing about him screamed danger. That's the thing people get wrong about danger. It rarely screams. It usually just stands very, very still in a crowd that's moving. And he was still. Everyone else was waving, leaning, lifting their phones, jostling for a better view. He wasn't doing any of that. He was just watching the little girl in the yellow coat, and his right hand was inside his jacket. I felt something turn over in my stomach, a cold, sick feeling I had no name for yet. I was 9 days in. I didn't trust myself. I thought, maybe he's just cold. Maybe his hand's cold. Maybe I'm imagining it because I want something to happen, because standing still for hours makes your mind invent things. I almost talked myself out of it. And then his eyes moved, and they didn't move the way a fan's eyes move. A fan watches the whole family, the spectacle, the moment. This man's eyes were locked on one thing only: the child. He was measuring the distance. I know that now. At the time, I just knew in some animal part of me that something was wrong. I should have said something immediately. I want to be honest with you, all these years later, because there's no point telling this story if I dress myself up as a hero. I froze. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, I froze. 20 years old and frozen. But Marsh had seen him too. I don't know how long Marsh had been watching that man. Longer than me, I'm sure. 19 years sharpens you into something that sees trouble before trouble knows it's trouble. Marsh hadn't moved. His face was still the same carved stone it always was, but I was close enough to feel it, the change in him. Like standing next to a wall and feeling it become a wall that could move. The family came closer, 12 feet, 10. Cora spotted us. The guards. She'd clearly been told about the men in the tall hats because her whole face lit up and she tugged her father's hand and pointed right at Marsh, right at the two of us, and said something I couldn't hear but could read on her lips. The soldiers. Prince Alaric smiled down at her, said something back, started gently to steer her a little closer to the railing so she could see us better. Closer to the railing. Closer to the man in the gray jacket. And I watched that man's hand begin to come out of his coat. I need to slow down here. Because what happened next happened fast, faster than I can tell it. And if I rush through it the way it actually went, you'll miss everything that mattered. So let me stretch the seconds out for you, the way they stretched for me. The man's hand was coming out of his coat. I want you to understand what that looks like from where I was standing. I was 4, maybe 5 feet behind the railing, raised up slightly, the way our posts are. I had a clear line. I could see the top of his cap. I could see his shoulder shift, that small tell a body gives before it does something its owner has already decided to do. The shoulder always knows first. And I could see the little girl in the yellow coat, 10 feet away, reaching up on her toes to wave at us. Time did something strange. You hear people say that and you think it's a thing people say. It isn't, it's real. The crowd noise dropped away, not because it stopped, but because my ears stopped caring about it. The flags went quiet. The pigeons. All of it. The whole square narrowed down to a straight line between that man's hand and that child's yellow coat. I opened my mouth. I think I was going to shout. I'll never know what I would have shouted because I never got the chance. Marsh moved. Now, I have to explain something about the guard, or this won't land the way it should. We are not allowed to leave our posts. I told you that at the start. I told you to remember it. It is not a small rule. It is the rule. The post is sacred. There are stories, true ones, of guards who stood absolutely still while tourists screamed at them, while drunk men shoved them, while a man once collapsed from heatstroke 6 feet away and the guard did not break, because breaking the post is the one thing you do not do. You stamp. You give a sharp command. You raise your weapon if you must. But your boots stay where the kingdom planted them. 19 years Marsh had kept his post, through everything. Through the funeral of the old king when the whole square wept and he did not. through a riot once, years before my time, that the older lads still talked about in low voices. Marsh was the post. The post was Marsh. And Marsh left it. He didn't hesitate. That's the part I still can't fully describe. There was no decision in it that I could see. One instant he was carved stone beside me, and the next he was 3 strides gone, already moving, the rifle coming off his shoulder and across his body, his boots hammering the stone in a way I had never once heard a guard's boots move. People screamed. The sound came rushing back into my ears all at once, that strange, muffled silence shattering, and suddenly the whole square was noise and motion. Someone shrieked. A camera clattered to the ground. The crowd at the railing recoiled in a wave, that animal instinct where bodies pull back from a thing before the mind even understands what the thing is. Marsh hit the railing at full speed. He didn't go over it cleanly. There wasn't time for clean. He went over it like a man falling through a doorway, one hand slamming down on the top rail, his whole weight crashing forward into the crowd, into the gap where the man in the gray jacket stood with his hand out of his coat and his eyes still. Even then, even with 200 pounds of King's Guard coming down on him, still locked on that little girl. I was moving by then. I don't remember deciding to. I just remember the railing under my own hands, the shock of cold metal, and then the crowd, the press of bodies, elbows and shoulders, and someone's bag catching me across the chest. 9 days in. I had never been trained for this. There's no training that prepares you for the moment the still thing has to become the moving thing. Up ahead through the chaos, I saw Marsh and the man go down together. And I want to tell you what the prince did. Because everyone remembers Marsh, and they should. God knows they should. But the prince did something in that moment that the cameras barely caught. And it's the thing I think about most. Prince Alaric was 10 feet away, with his daughter's hand in his. When the screaming started, every instinct a person has says move toward safety. Pull the child away. Run. That's not cowardice. That's the oldest, deepest wiring a human body has. Get the precious thing away from the loud, fast, frightening thing. Alaric did the opposite. He didn't pull Cora back toward her mother, toward the guards behind them, toward the open street. He spun, scooped her up off her feet in one motion, and turned his own body between her and the danger. He put himself in the line, his back to the threat, his daughter's face pressed into his shoulder so she couldn't see, so she wouldn't see. I saw his face for half a second as he turned. The famous stern royal face, it was gone, completely gone. What was underneath was just a father, wide-eyed, terrified, and absolutely, immovably planted between his child and the world. He didn't run. A father who runs leaves his back to the thing chasing him. Alaric stood. He stood and he shielded, and he would have taken whatever came rather than let it reach her. And you could see in the set of his shoulders that there was no version of this where he moved aside. The whole thing, Marsh leaving his post, the vault over the railing, the prince turning, it all happened inside about 4 seconds. 4 seconds. I reached the railing as Marsh and the man came down. The crowd had pulled back enough now that I could see them on the ground. Marsh had the man's right arm, the hand, the thing that had been inside the coat, pinned and twisted up in a way, bent at an angle arms are not meant to bend, his knee driving down into the man's back to hold him flat against the stone. Whatever the man had been reaching for had gone skittering across the ground. I saw it slide and stop near a woman's shoe. She jerked her foot back from it like it was a live thing. I won't tell you what it was. The court told us not to afterward, and to be honest, I don't want it in your head any more than it's in mine. Just know it was the kind of thing that has no good reason to be in a stranger's coat at a children's event. The kind of thing that turns your blood to ice when you understand what was about to happen. The man was thrashing, screaming things I couldn't make them out, just rage and noise, the sound of a plan coming apart. Marsh didn't say a word. He just held him. All that 19 years of stillness, all that contained strength, pouring down into one immovable hold. The man might as well have been fighting the palace itself. I got over the railing. Don't ask me how, I don't remember it. I just remember being on the other side suddenly, my hands finding the man's flailing legs, pinning them the way Marsh had pinned his arm. Two plainclothes officers crashed in beside us a heartbeat later, then a third. The man disappeared under a pile of us. And Marsh only then lifted his head. He didn't look at the man. He didn't look at me. He looked up, past us all, to where the prince stood with the little girl in his arms. To make sure, that was the look. 19 years of training, a man's entire career hanging by a thread because he'd left his sacred post. And the first thing he did, the only thing, was lift his head to make sure the child was safe. Cora was safe. Her face was still buried in her father's shoulder. Her little hands were fisted in the back of his coat. She was crying the high, hiccuping cry of a frightened child who doesn't fully know what she's frightened of, only that the grown-ups got loud and scary all at once. But she was safe. She was whole. Her father had not moved an inch from in front of her. Alaric was looking down at Marsh. And here is a thing I will remember until the day I die. The Prince of Renfeld, with his terrified daughter clinging to him, with his own heart no doubt still going like a hammer, looked down at the guard sprawled on the ground over the man who would have hurt his child, and he gave him one small nod. Just a nod. He couldn't speak. I think if he'd tried to speak, nothing would have come out. But that nod said everything 1,000 words couldn't. It said, I saw what you did. It said, I will never forget it. It said thank you in the only language a man has left when his child has just been an arm's length from harm. Marsh nodded back. Once. Then he put his head down and kept holding the man until the officers had him fully in hand. The square was bedlam now. People crying. People filming, of course people were filming. This is the world we live in. Parents clutching their own children for no reason except that fear is contagious, and the sight of a near miss makes everyone hold their bobbies tighter. The other guards along the route had broken formation, moving in, forming a wall of dark uniforms around the royal family, hustling them back toward the palace gates. Princess Adela reached her husband and child, and the three of them folded together into one shape, the way a family does, and the guards closed around them, and they were gone through the gates before most of the crowd even understood what they'd just seen. And on the ground, with the man finally subdued and the officers hauling him up, Edwin Marsh got slowly to his feet. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his knuckles, the man's or his own, I couldn't tell. His tall hat had come off somewhere in the chaos, and one of the schoolchildren, a tiny boy who couldn't have been more than 5, picked it up off the ground and held it out to him with both hands, the way you'd hand someone something precious. Marsh took it, he looked at the boy, and he said, I was close enough to hear it, he said, thank you, lad, good man. The boy beamed like he'd been given a medal. Then Marsh straightened his coat. He set the hat back on his head. He checked that his rifle was secure. And he turned in the middle of all that chaos and noise and crying, and he walked back toward his post. Back toward the empty patch of stone where he'd stood for hours, where he was supposed to have stood the whole time, where, by every rule of the guard, he should never have left. He walked back to it like a man going home, and he took up his position, feet planted, eyes forward, stone again. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't, 4 seconds in a lifetime ago, broken the one rule that defined his entire life, to save a little girl in a yellow coat. I stood there, 20 years old, 9 days in, with a stranger's struggle still buzzing in my arms and my own heart trying to climb out of my chest. And I watched the most disciplined man I had ever met do the most disciplined thing I have ever seen, right after doing the most undisciplined thing of his career. And I understood something then that I've spent the rest of my life trying to put into words. There are rules, and there are the things the rules are for. Marsh hadn't broken the post. Not really. The post was never about standing still. The post was about the child in the yellow coat and every other child and every other soul in that square. The standing still was just the shape it took on the quiet days. When the day came that the post needed him to move, he moved. And when it was over, he came back. But it wasn't over. Not for Marsh. Because leaving your post in the king's guard is not a thing the kingdom simply forgives because your reasons were good. There would be questions. There would be an inquiry. There would be men in rooms who hadn't been in the square, who would look at the rules on paper and ask why a guard with 19 years of service had done the one thing a guard must never do. I didn't know that yet standing there. I was still just trying to breathe. But Marsh knew. I think he'd known before he ever went over that railing. I think that's the truest measure of what he did, that he knew exactly what it might cost him, and he went over anyway without 1/2 second of hesitation for a child who wasn't even his. The officers led the man away. The crowd slowly came back to itself, and the rain that had been threatening all morning finally broke, soft at first, then steady, falling on the square, on the crowd, on the empty patch of railing, on 2 guards standing once more at their posts as if the whole world hadn't just tilted on its edge. I didn't know then what would happen to Marsh. I only knew that I would have followed that man anywhere. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. I've always thought that was fitting somehow. The whole kingdom seemed to go quiet under it. The newspapers were full of nothing else. The square outside Greymont stayed busy, busier, if anything, but the mood was different. People came not to see the changing of the guard. They came to stand at the railing where it happened and look at the patch of stone and go quiet. Some of them left flowers. Yellow ones mostly. I don't think anyone organized that. I think the first person just thought of the little girl in the yellow coat and brought yellow, and then everyone did. By the second day there was a whole drift of them against the base of the railing, soft and bright in the rain. Nobody knew Marsh's name yet. That came later. For those first few days he was just the guard who jumped the railing, the guard who saved the princess. People talked about him like a thing out of a story, and meanwhile the actual man, the real Edwin Marsh, was sitting in rooms answering questions. I wasn't allowed in those rooms. I was too junior, and anyway I was a witness, so they kept me separate. But I gave my account. 3 times to 3 different sets of serious men. I told them exactly what I told you, that the man's hand was coming out of his coat, that the child was 10 feet away, that I froze and Marsh didn't. I made sure to say that part every time, that I froze and he didn't. I wanted it on the record. I wanted them to understand that if Marsh had done what the rules said, if he'd kept his post and called it in and waited, there wouldn't have been time. I'd done the math in my own head 100 times. The man was 4 people from the railing. The child was reaching toward us. By the time a command was shouted and acted on, by the time anyone else closed that distance, there wasn't time, there was only Marsh. But here's what I learned in those days, the hard lesson underneath the whole thing. The rules of the guard don't bend for probably. They don't bend for almost certainly. The men in the rooms weren't cruel. They weren't fools. They understood what Marsh had done and what it had prevented. But their job was to protect something too, the thing the post itself protects. Because if a guard can decide, on his own judgment, in his own moment, to leave his post, then the post means a little less for every guard who comes after. And the day comes, maybe, when one of them decides wrong. When one of them leaves a post that should have been held and someone gets hurt because of it. That's what they had to weigh, not whether Marsh was a hero. Everyone knew he was a hero. They had to weigh whether being a hero was allowed to be a defense, and what it would mean for the next 19-year man, and the next, if it was. It went on for 2 weeks, 2 weeks of the kingdom holding its breath, 2 weeks of Marsh coming in, answering questions, going home to Tilly, coming back. He never complained. I saw him a few times in the corridors and he always looked the same. Stone. Calm. He asked me once how my blisters were healing. I told him fine. He nodded like that was the most important news he'd heard all day. "You did all right out there, Pell," he told me, "for day 9. "I froze, sir." "You unfroze. That's the part that counts." He almost smiled. "Most men never unfreeze at all. They just call it staying calm and go home and lie to themselves about it for 40 years. I've held on to that. All my life you unfroze, that's the part that counts. Now, I have to tell you about the day the decision came down, because nobody expected it to go the way it went. The inquiry was set to give its ruling on a gray Thursday. We all assumed the worst. The talk in the barracks was that they had no choice, that the rule was the rule, and even though every man of us would have done what Marsh did, the kingdom couldn't be seen to reward the breaking of the post. The kindest guess was a quiet dismissal. Full honors, a pension, a handshake, and out. The unkindest guesses I won't repeat. Marsh himself seemed to expect it. He'd started bringing his personal things home, a little at a time. The photograph of Tilly stayed in his coat, though. He told me once that he'd take that out last of all. And then, the morning the ruling was due, before any of it could happen, the palace sent for him. Not the inquiry, the palace. Prince Alaric had asked to see him. This wasn't done. Royals don't summon guards. There's a whole machinery between them and us, layers of officers and protocol, and it does not bend for a single soldier. But Alaric had bent it. He'd made it clear, I heard later, that he would not allow a ruling to come down on the man who'd saved his daughter without first speaking to him himself, face to face, as men, not as a prince and a guardsman. I wasn't in that room either, but Marsh told me about it years later, on the night before I left the guard myself. He told me quietly, the way he'd once talked about Tilly's tooth, and I'll give it to you the way he gave it to me. He said the prince was waiting for him alone. No officers. No Princess Cora was kept away from all of it, which was right. She was 6. She'd had nightmares for a week and didn't need to be paraded out. Just Alaric standing by a window, looking older than his photographs. Marsh stood at attention. The prince told him to stand at ease. Marsh did not fully. 19 years doesn't let you. And for a while Marsh said, neither of them spoke. Then the prince said, they're going to rule against you. Marsh said he already knew that. The prince said, I won't allow it. And Marsh, and this is the part that tells you everything about the man, Marsh said, sir, with respect, you should allow it. The rule is right. The rule kept your daughter safe for years before I ever broke it. If they let me off because I'm popular, the next man learns the wrong lesson. Imagine that. The man whose whole future was hanging by a thread, arguing against himself, because he believed in the thing more than he believed in his own skin. Alaric, Marsh said, was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said something Marsh never forgot, and now neither have I. He said, you're right that the rule is what kept her safe, but the rule didn't go over that railing. You did. A rule is just a promise the kingdom makes to its children, and you're the man who kept it when it mattered. I will not let them punish you for being the proof that the promise is real. Then the prince told him what he'd decided to do. Not as a man pulling strings in secret, Alaric wasn't that. He was going to stand before the inquiry himself. The Prince of Renfeld in person as a witness and a father, to say what he'd seen and what he believed. And he did. I was there for that part. They let the witnesses in for it. Alaric walked into that room of serious men, and he didn't sit in the place they offered him. He stood. And he told them in a voice that didn't shake even though I think it wanted to, exactly what had happened. How he turned to shield his daughter and known, in that turning, that he couldn't get her clear in time on his own. How he'd felt rather than seen the guard go past him. How the threat was on the ground before he'd finished his own turn. And then he said the thing that ended it. He looked at the men of the inquiry and he said, you are asking whether a guard may leave his post. I understand why you ask it, but I want you to understand what you are truly deciding. You are deciding what kind of men stand outside that gate. Whether they are men who follow the rule even past the moment the rule was made for, or men who understand what the rule is for, and have the courage to serve that instead of the letter of it. I know which kind of man I want standing between my child and the world. I am looking at him. And if you dismiss him, you will be telling every man who takes up that post after him that the right choice, the human choice, the Father's choice, is the one that ends a career. I will not have my daughter guarded by men who have been taught that lesson." The room was silent. I have never heard a silence like it. They didn't rule against him. It wasn't a simple pardon. The inquiry was too proud for that, and maybe they were right to be. What they did was finer. They wrote a finding that the post had not, in the deepest sense, been abandoned, that a guard moving to neutralize a direct and immediate threat to a protected person was fulfilling the post, not breaking it, and they wrote new words into the standing orders to say so. Words that hadn't been there before. Words that are there to this day, because of what one man did in 4 seconds on a gray Tuesday. So Marsh kept his post, the real one and the one on paper both. He served 8 more years after that. He made it to 27 in the end. When he finally retired, they gave him a proper send-off, and the king himself, the old Prince Alaric was king by then, pinned something on his chest that I won't describe because Marsh never liked it being talked about. He said the only medal that ever meant anything to him was a tall hat handed back by a 5-year-old boy in the middle of the worst day of his life. Cora grew up. You'd know her face if you saw it. She's a young woman now, doing good work in the eastern provinces, the ones that flooded, the ones her mother was opening a garden for on the day it all happened. I don't think she remembers much of that morning. She was 6. They kept the worst of it from her, as they should have. But I'm told that every year on the date, a small arrangement of yellow flowers arrives at a modest house on the edge of the city. No card, no name, it doesn't need one. Marsh knows who they're from. So does she. As for me, I served my time and I left and I made a quiet life. The kind Marsh always said was waiting for me once I'd given up pretending I was made of stone. But I never forgot day 9. I never forgot what it taught me. People ask me sometimes when they hear I was there, what was it really about? The rule or the rescue? The discipline or the breaking of it? And I tell them what I've told you. It was never the two things fighting each other. It was the deepest discipline of all knowing, in the one moment that ever truly counts, exactly what you're standing there for. Marsh stood still for 19 years, and the whole of that stillness, every cold hour of it, was only ever practice for the 4 seconds he moved. The little girl in the yellow coat grew up and grew old and never knew most of it. And that, in the end, is the whole point of men like Edwin Marsh. The ones they protect best never have to know how close it came.